Thank you for joining us for this discussion of Guantanamo 22. What's the future of the prison camp? My name is Peter Bergen. I'm Vice President at New America. We have a very distinguished group of people to discuss this issue. Dr. Fionnuala Ní Aloin, Mahamadou Slahi, and Andy Worthington. Aloin is the University Regents Professor at University of Minnesota and the former UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. In 2023, as Special Rapporteur, she made a technical visit to the Guantanamo facility in Cuba. Mahamadou Slahi was detained at Guantanamo from 2002 until his release in 2016. He's the author of Guantanamo Diary, a memoir of his experience. And Andy Worthington is the co-founder of Closed Guantanamo and author of the Guantanamo Files. So, Fionnuala, we'll begin with you.
Thank you, everyone. In some ways, it's like an auspicious day, but it feels in a way, the fact that we're still having this conversation 22 years later seems both a tragedy in itself and speaks to the stickiness, the inability to move past Guantanamo. I thought what I would do is very briefly for the audience, acknowledging in particular my co-panelists and the work that has been done, particularly by former detainees. And I think here it's really important that we elevate and continue to say that the best voices on the situation in Guantanamo are the men who survived and are the advocates for other men who remain and the men who've left. My visit to the detention facility was the first visit by a UN special procedure mechanism, so an independent human rights expert. And I think I start by saying, praise should be given to the Biden administration for allowing that visit to happen. And my report, the report I issued, had multiple recommendations, and it didn't make easy reading. And I think the administration acknowledged that it disagreed with many of my findings. And the core finding, I think the one that's the most important, is that the totality of the ongoing, what we would call conditions of confinement, from health to shackling, to access to family, to access to lawyers, the day-to-day lives of those 30 men who remain, amounts to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment at Guantanamo Bay, and may in individual cases meet the threshold for torture. So the story of torture is not over at Guantanamo. And as such, it remains a live global sort of symbol of the endurance of the use of torture and the inability to have accountability for torture by multiple US administrations. And I think in some ways, it's really obvious to say close Guantanamo. So I'm going to say that, but I'm going to say there's some really important things we can do in the short run to make the lives of the 30 men who are still there better. And I want to say a couple of things about that and then talk about those resettled or returned. There's what I'd call, I don't want to call it but these are low-hanging fruit. These are things that could be done easily and will take this administration away from the finding that they are also contributing to the ongoing use of torture, inhuman, and degrading treatment at the facility. The first is every single person in that facility who are elderly, they're all elderly, and many have these complex health needs. They need torture rehabilitation. They need it now. They needed it 10 years ago. And the fact that comprehensive torture rehabilitation hasn't been made available actually contributes to the ongoing finding of torture, inhuman, and degrading treatment under international law. The second thing we need is independent medical care. The doctors who are there, it's not that they're not professional. I met and talked to all of them. They are professionals, but they're in the chain of command, and they don't have access to their clients, their patients' medical records. And they're not trusted for good reason by their patients. And so we need independent doctors. And there's plenty of ways to do that. It's been done in many other places at many other times. It's not rocket science, and it could be done easily. The third thing we need is that the SOPs, the rules that apply to the detainees, they should have access to those rules, because the arbitrariness of not knowing the rules contributes to the finding that they continue to be subject to torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. They need access to their families. And so at a minimum, and this is the bare minimum, every single detainee who remains should get at least one family call a month, whether they're high value or so-called non-high value. And that phrase itself is really, I think, a phrase of challenge because it's so dehumanizing. And The final thing I would say is, for the current situation, we need to standardize access to counsel. So all men need to have the same access to counsel. And we need to safeguard the prohibition of evidence so that torture-derived evidence isn't used in any proceedings. That's the now. Let me say two more things. We have a group of men, 16 of them, who've been cleared. These men have been told by the United States government, by every single part of the interagency, that they are free to go, except it turns out they're not. They remain incarcerated because they cannot be transferred. And it's my firm view that every single molecule of state effort should be made, particularly by the White House, to have these men taken out of Guantánamo. Their continued detention is arbitrary under international law, and it contributes to the finding that they may be subject to torture and are certainly in the area of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Finally, just two words about the transfer and settlement process. It has always concerned me that men transferred, and Mohamedou will speak to this as eloquently as he always does, is that the failure to treat the men who've been transferred with dignity is just an indictment in its own right. And it's a breach of the torture convention when you transfer people and you don't treat them with dignity, and you don't allow them the means to live a dignified life, whether that's access to their medical records, a life without penury, a life with access to the basic minimums that allow for dignity. Many of the men who've been transferred are living in appalling conditions, and I'm just going to name three of them. Ravel Minzanov, held in the UAE, transferred to torture effectively. He was transferred by the United States, was disappeared, is in arbitrary detention, and I, as Special Rapporteur, communicated to the UAE government about the unacceptability of holding this fragile, ill man in this way. The second two I would like to highlight are two men who were recently transferred. Saïd Bakouche, who was transferred back to Algeria in April, so a few months ago, also arrested on arrival, subject, we believe, to a range of treatment that may include torture. And the final is Mr. Al-Sharabi, transferred to Saudi Arabia. Again, I wrote to the Saudi government. We know that he was arrested. We know that he was disappeared. So I'd close by just saying, a state as powerful as the United States, its diplomatic assurances should mean something. When states take people that you have tortured and then go on to torture them again, then your diplomatic assurances are not worth the paper they're written on. And that should matter to the United States. And these men need the ongoing support and intervention of the United States, as well as the obligations of the states who accepted them, for those states to live up to those obligations. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Fionnuala. Andy?
Thank you so much for that, Fionnuala. I do hope that anyone here who hasn't read your report will read it. It was devastating and accurate and extremely important. I will follow up, if I may, on the situation of the 30 men who are still held and how they have all been failed by every branch of the United States government over this long period of 22 years since the prison opened. And I first began doing events on the anniversary in 2011, and here we are. And every step of the way, getting men out of Guantánamo is arguably harder than getting blood out of a stone. And that's because of the problems of tearing up international and domestic laws and treaties when you set up a prison, a detention facility in the first place. Fionnuala mentioned the 16 men who have long been approved for release from Guantánamo. And that's over half of the 30 men still held. These men have been waiting to be freed since the US decided it didn't want to hold them, for between 16 months and 3 years and 3 months. And in 3 exceptional cases have actually been held for 14 years since the US decided it didn't want to hold them. The problem for all of these men is that they were approved for release through administrative review processes that have no legal weight. There is no judge that they can turn to demand if, as seems the case, the United States is dragging its heels releasing them, to demand that something is done for them. They are effectively prisoners of the executive branch of the United States. They are as fundamentally without rights because of this as they were on the day that Guantanamo opened. And the purpose, as I'm sure we all know, when Guantanamo opened, was that human beings would be taken there and held without any rights whatsoever as human beings. Over the years, there have been various legal struggles to secure rights for them. But here we are 22 years on, and these men are as fundamentally without rights as they were when the prison opened. Beyond the 16 men, there are 3 men who are still held as what the media, when it was paying attention, called forever prisoners. These are men who are deliberately held without charge or trial indefinitely by the United States government. What President Biden did when he took office was that he actually held over 20 men who were forever prisoners. And he recognized, because of a lot of criticism, including from members of his own Congress, that it was completely unacceptable for these men to continue to be held indefinitely without charge or trial. Most of those men got then shunted into the category of men approved for release, but who are still held. But there is something particularly horrendous, I think, after 22 years, that 3 men are still held at Guantanamo who can't even be approved for release. Every time a review comes around, they decide that they have to continue to be held. One of these men is Abu Zubaydah. He is the man for whom the post 9/11 torture program was invented. He was a man who was described as the number 3 in Al-Qaeda, even though when he was captured in March 2002, there were definitely people in the US intelligence community who knew that he was no such thing. The United States government has never charged him with a crime. They tortured him abominably, and it is reasonable to suggest that the reason that he has never been approved for release is because they don't want to free him because of what he knows. The other 11 men who are held at Guantanamo are caught up in the broken military commission system, which is Guantanamo's apology for a functioning trial system. The problem with the military commissions has always been that it was intended to prosecute people who had been tortured, whereas the problem with that is that torturing people makes their cases incompatible with the pursuit of justice. And this is the case still to this day, that the 9 active cases that are ongoing at Guantanamo are caught up in what I think every year I call a Groundhog Day of injustice, where the government tries to hide the evidence of what was done to them in the black sites, and the defense teams quite obviously are trying to expose that as part of their job of trying to defend their clients. So where we go with this, I don't know. There were plea deals that were being negotiated, which I think is the only real way out of this after all this time. And yet we hear that, unfortunately, President Biden has not wanted to proceed with those. I will just mention as well that one of these men, the only one who was convicted in a trial, has now been held for 15 years in what is fundamentally solitary confinement. He's held in a prison block in Guantanamo on his own as the only convict of the trial system. And the United States didn't intend it to be that way. They thought there would be loads more cases, and at least he'd be in the same corridor as other people. But the collapse of the military commissions over the years has been such that he's spent most of that time fundamentally alone. And there is something fundamentally wrong with that as well, that a man has been held by the United States government for 15 years in solitary confinement. So, you know, that's where I think we're at 22 years on. What we really, really need to see from President Biden, and this is his last year in office, who knows what's going to happen in November, is movement on Guantanamo to release these men who have been approved for release. And it can be done. They had a prisoner called Majid Khan who reached a plea deal in his military commission. They had to release him. Not like the men who were approved for release through administrative processes. They had to release him. They spent time, money, effort securing a new home for him in Belize. And so if the effort were to be there, homes can be found for these men. And it's absolutely imperative that that happens. So thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Mohamedou?
Thank you, Peter, for having me. Thank you, Finola, and thank you, Andy. I just would like to say that I second everything that the previous guests, Finola and Andy, said. Absolutely true, and can be backed with hard evidence. For those who don't know me, my name is Mohammed Salahi. After I come from Mauritania, I studied in Germany, and I came back to my home country to visit my mother, who was sick. And after the event of 9/11, the horrific events of 9/11, should I say, two police agents came to our home. It was Ramadan time, that is the holy month in the Islamic calendar, and they asked me to come with them. I was very scared. I was shaking, but the fear in the eyes of my mother, I couldn't explain. There are no words to explain the fear that I saw in my mother. And my mother is a very strong woman. She bore 12 children. My father passed on when I was about 11 years of age, and she took care of us. And she was a very strong woman. I know this is cliche, but it does not make it less true. And she told me, I know why they came to get you. I said, why? She said, because you watch TV. So we grew up under a military dictatorship, and we were not supposed to be informed. And even my mother never went to school, but she understands that the government didn't want us to be informed, didn't want us to know anything that was going on. I remember watching my mother through the rear view mirror as those two police agents led me away. And after, she was like disappearing slowly until she was gone. I never saw my mother again. This is completely outside anything people in your part of the world, in this part of the world where I am now, is even imaginable, that someone is being arrested without being faced with charges or without even an arrest warrant. And this is coming not only from the US as a country who has interest, but from the leader of the free world. And I was taken to different countries. My first country was Jordan, and I cannot explain to you the fear. I wanted the plane to crash. I did not want to arrive to that destination. I remember hearing them through the communication as they landed in Cyprus. I was wishing that the Cyprus government would come to the plane and see who was in the plane, because I want to be taken and put in a prison in the country, because I was entering the country illegally. I had no paper, no passport. I was blindfolded completely. But my prayer went unanswered. I spent 8 months in Jordan. Most of the time, I did not know whether it was day or night. I used to put a scratch in my cell every day to count the days. But when I saw the date, I lost 10 days. I don't know how, I don't know when. When I arrived in Guantánamo Bay, I was then taken to Afghanistan. And then I was taken to Guantánamo Bay, where I spent 15 years and 5 years under house arrest. I was chosen for the so-called enhanced interrogation technique, i.e. torture. And when I say torture, I describe some of it in my book. Some of my co-detainees died under this condition, like Gul Rahman died. He died in the cold room I described. And I also know Daliwar, who died also in the same prison that I was in Bagram. He was beaten to death. And I just want to confirm during this time what Finola said about the doctors. Of course, the doctors, I have good experience with most of them. But I remember one day, because when they started the torture program, I was not allowed to take my crucial medicine because I have blood pressure that I had in prison because of the mistreatment. And I had sciatic nerve that was that worsened due to the torture and beating, but they cut all my medication. They told me when I start cooperating, they would give me my medication back. One day I collapsed in the interrogation. They took me to the doctor. I think he was commander in the Navy. He was skinny. He wasn't very tall, and he wasn't also very short. I would say about 173 centimeters. And when I saw him, I saw in him my salvation. I want him to see my pain. And I think he felt that. And he told me, detainee, because I was called detainee. I had no name. I can't do anything because the people who interrogate you are the people who are responsible. And he looked at the escort team that brought me and he told them, this guy is really sick. He is really sick. This is no joke about it. And then they took me away. They led me away. So, and this is actually what the doctors can do because they have no power. Of course, some of them cooperate with the government to draft the interrogation, mostly psychologists and psychiatrists. But this is not the regular doctor who really are trying to help people, And I was designated as first death penalty case. And I remember vividly when Sergeant Charlie came to me and explained to me that I was chosen for death penalty. And he was going into details what it meant. I had no feeling whatsoever. I was numb, knowing deep inside that I'm going to be murdered for something I know I didn't do. That was another level of pain and then of feeling and of humiliation in front of my family, who thought they brought me up as a good guy. And they had so much hopes. Now I'm going to be a mass murderer and I would be executed in a country that I don't know. I never went to. I never applied for a visa to visit the United States of America. I never thought or imagined applying for a visa, but here we are. I'm in the US and I'm going to be executed. Thanks to the works of people like Andy and people like Finola, people like me are free. But the work is not done. The United States of America is not only just another country. The United States of America is a country that leads our hopes, democracy, human rights. And if America allows itself to put those people behind bars without due process, what could we say to China? What could we say to other countries in the Middle East and in Africa? To them now, detention outside the rule of law is the rule, actually, if you are political dissent, if you are in a political dissent opposition. And they always quote the United States of America. And I just want to tell you that the last point I want to tell you, I know Finola treads always carefully when she speaks. When the United States of America sent people to other countries, the criteria are not innocent all the time. Because in my case, I had other options. I could go to a European country, but that not what the US wants me. The US, one of the very important criteria is to send a detainee to a country where they can be controlled, where their human rights can be violated if the United States of America deems it necessary. And the other point, one of the hardest day for me is when they came to me and they say that my brother passed on and my mother passed on. The level of pain that I couldn't say goodbye to either of them was so hard. And I know Fionnuala knows this, but we weren't allowed to see imams. So I think Americans have good sense of humor. They brought me a priest, a Christian priest, but he was black. I guess they figured black priest, Muslim, same thing. And I'm so happy again, and I'm so thankful to Peter and to Andy and to Fionnuala for doing this beautiful work. And I hope that together we can make the world a better place, a more peaceful place to live on. And let's
Hamdu, you're frozen. Let me, maybe if you turn your video off or just rejoin the conversation, we'll be able to hear you. Meanwhile, we have a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm just going to jump straight into those. And this one I think probably is best addressed to Fionnuala. How can the US government be persuaded to improve conditions now for prisoners, i.e. family contact and torture rehabilitation? Where does the pressure need to come from? And I'll combine that with, this is from Sarah Birch, and I'll combine that with another question related from Jack Krupansky. Has the current administration or senior Democrats in Congress given any indication as to their position or posture on finally closing or reforming Guantanamo?
So I think the pressure, it's very difficult. We're in an election year. And I think, Peter, we started this conversation by acknowledging that actually Guantanamo doesn't exist in the American imagination anymore. It's so far away. It's part of the reason why it was so effective to put it in a place that's not just physically far away, it's like physically off the coast of, but also where, unlike had trials or processes taking place on the territory of the United States, we would have a sense of ownership over it. So part of the challenge is to continue to make Guantanamo live and present to ordinary Americans as well as to political elites in the United States. And I think the answer and pressure lies, in some ways, it lies globally, because actually, if you sit in the United Nations at the Security Council and the United States says Xinjiang, the first thing the Chinese government will say is Guantanamo. When the United States government speaks about the treatment of detainees in Russian-occupied Crimea, what is the answer? The answer is Guantanamo. You have no legitimacy to speak on how other nations treat people when you yourself do not live up to those ideals. People understand a double standard when they see it. And the greatest cost of this has been what Mohamedou described, is that the aspirations, the hopes, the values that so many people around the world place in the United States are actually undermined by the continued existence of this place. But not only that, the callous disregard to the human rights of those who are still there, as well as those who have left. And there's an object lesson, which is if you can do that, we can do that too. This is why we've had no accountability for Xinjiang. This is why we have 70,000 men, women, and children detained in northeast Syria, because states have learned there's almost no cost to indefinite detention without trial. So how do we change that? Well, actually, it requires contrition. It requires a recognition of the cost to the United States, as well as to the men who've been harmed and their families. And one of the things I said in my report, and I think it's absolutely true, who else was harmed by this? And I, over the course of the last year, met hundreds of 9/11 victims' families. Is the families of 9/11 were deeply harmed by the choices that were made to harm men who had no relationship to the events of 9/11. They will never get justice. There's no justice for 9/11 families. Why? Because there's a direct line between what you did to men like Mohamedou and the inability to actually account for the harms of 9/11. That is the cost. And you won't undo that cost. So cost has to come from other states, and it still sits out there. Cost has to come from the political courage of a president who's prepared not just to close the detention facility, and there's a roadmap in my report on how to do that, but also to actually hold the people who committed torture responsible. There is no statute of limitations on torture, none. So people who can't travel now won't be able to travel for the rest of their lives. And the point is that the cost of Guantanamo does not end for the United States, even if it has lost its imaginative pull to the American public and the American media.
Mohamedou, what are you doing now, and how is life now that you're out of this 15 years of being in American arbitrary detention?
Thank you so much. Today, I'm a writer in residence with a theater company called Night and a debate club in Amsterdam called the Bali. And I try also as much as possible to do work in related to human rights and rights of people, to do process, whatever that means. And so that's why I enjoy just trying to make a difference every day, very little difference every day.
I wanted to mention to anybody listening, watching, Andy was really the first person to do a systematic investigation of who was being held by Guantanamo, because it's easy to forget that the US government wasn't admitting who it was holding. And so Andy did years of investigation, which resulted in his book about Guantanamo, to find out who was actually being held, because that itself was a secret. So, Andy, one of the questions from the audience is from Larry: can we do more to highlight how former prisoners like Mohamedou have succeeded in rebuilding their lives, rejoining their families, finding work, reintegrating in society, etc.?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I mean, I think we are always, those of us who care about Guantanamo are always pleased when we get to meet people like Mohamedou, who has been able to re-engage with his life in a meaningful way. I mean, I live in the UK, where I'm fortunate that there are other former prisoners around who've been able to rebuild their lives. We've been seeing Mansour Adayfi recently, who only last year, finally got a passport to enable him to travel out of Serbia, where he was sent in 2016, and subsequently, held in another kind of prison where he wasn't free. But I think the important thing is that while it's obviously great to celebrate these success stories, it's really important politically and morally that actually in so many other cases, as Fionnuala has explained so well, being released from Guantanamo is absolutely no guarantee that the abuse is going to stop. And I think it's very fundamental from Fionnuala's report that the notion that the diplomatic assurances that are agreed between the United States government and host governments are fundamentally worthless. They're secretive, so we don't know what they involve anyway, but they are so often just discarded that ought to be a source of profound shame for the United States government, because its obligations don't end when people are released, and yet everything that it has done so often has demonstrated that former prisoners are just people to be disposed of. And as Mohamedou said, to be also kept under surveillance if they're regarded as some kind of threat, with their rights not respected. Personalizing the stories of the prisoners, I think, is always helpful. And I think it's been one of the failures of the United States media that they haven't tried to humanize people. That was what my journey into Guantanamo was about, was, hey, these are real people. They have real stories. They all had hopes and dreams and fears. you know, a colossal mistake was made because most of these people were not enemies of the United States. Almost everybody had no involvement with terrorism, but we haven't humanized them enough. And I wish we could do more on that front.
Well, this is a question for Mohamedou on that question from Youssef Jaglidi. And he asks, are these human stories of pain able to move things forward for the immediate closure of Guantanamo?
I think everything matters, you know, because the United States of America is a very powerful country. It's very hard, you know, to compel them or to move them. But I think talking about Guantanamo Bay, doing events about Guantanamo Bay, like the work that Vignola does, that is official, that is very crucial, very important. The work that is grassroots work that Andy and I are trying to do, it makes a difference, but it's accumulative. It's not something that is going to just like that change everything, because it's very important to convince American people that Guantanamo Bay is not good for America. It's not good for the security of America. It's not good for the reputation of the United States of America. You know, I mean, we can repeat this a million times, or we can say it one time. How can the United States of America tell China to respect human rights or tell Russia to respect human rights in Ukraine? It's a joke. It's not meant to be a genuine statement, just meant to be a joke, you know.
Vanilla, this is a question from Anonymous, but I think is best directed to you. How is the withdrawal from Afghanistan affect the legal and other efforts around Guantanamo? Because after all, I mean, we know the U.S. tied itself in a series of knots, which it's still trying to untie. But they were sort of associated with the war in Afghanistan or the war against the Taliban and Al Qaeda, at least that was, So now that's over. And Biden himself, of course, went through the Trump withdrawal agreement. So he's the person who ended that war. Does that change the legal situation around the detention camp that was associated with that war?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. I mean, on one very practical level, I think it's just one detainee, but there is currently a legal position in the United States that there are countries that you cannot transfer detainees who are currently held to. Afghanistan is one of those countries, meaning that men who should be able to go home, who've been cleared to go home, are also, but you can't go to your own country. And that's at a very sort of micro level, the barrier to return has a very concrete effect for specific individuals. But I think more broadly, I mean, and Peter, you know Afghanistan better almost than anyone on this call, but I have remained enormously surprised by the failure to actually pause and reflect on 20 years of the post-war, the global war on terror, which was triggered by the invasion of Afghanistan by the United States, the colossal failure of state building in Afghanistan, the failure to account for the human rights violations, not just clearly there were human rights violations committed by the Taliban and other non-state armed groups, but the United States' own use of extraterritorial force, specifically drones, the terrorizing of the civilian population, which created the conditions conducive to undo 20 years of so-called investment in building a state in Afghanistan. It would behoove us all to reflect on the object lessons of the failure of Afghanistan, which are intimately tied up with, of course, the rendition and torture of hundreds of men from Afghanistan to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and other sites. It's not by accident, I would suggest, that a number of the current leaders of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan were detained prisoners. And I think it would behoove us to think about the consequences of what the misuse of force, the misuse of the carceral power of the state, the systematization of torture, what that does in terms of the other policy objectives of the United States. And I want to echo something that Mohamedou has said, which is this has not served the United States well. This has not done the task it was intended. It has not made us safer in the United States. And as someone who spent a great deal of time also in Syria and other parts of that region, when we think about the ways in which Guantanamo has become this point of radicalization because of the failure to address the human rights violations that took place. And it underscores that fundamental point that abuse by states is one of the most sort of significant push factors in radicalization and violence. And so can we learn that lesson? Can we do things differently? Can we acknowledge our mistakes? Can we make remedy where remedy is needed? This, it seems to me, is the object lesson we need to learn from Afghanistan, not just on a human rights basis, but because if we don't learn that lesson from a security perspective, none of us are safe.
You mentioned the 9/11 families, and of course, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's the self-confessed mastermind of 9/11, which, by the way, he told Al Jazeera under no compulsion a year before he was arrested in Pakistan. He was arrested in 2003, so he's been in the Guantanamo. Well, first of all, he's in black sites, and he was waterboarded and all the other things that happened to him. And then, of course, he ended up in Guantanamo. He's been there. And we've got a number of questions from the audience, and I'm just going to put it into one about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, because obviously, and I think Andy mentioned the plea deal, or maybe you did, Fionnuala, the plea deal that was brewing. The plea deal, as I understand it, is basically there will be no death penalty, and we will not be put in supermax. Is that kind of right? That was the plea deal that was being discussed.
There's a little more to it than that. I mean, clearly non-transfer to the United States, which would include taking off the death penalty. It would include torture rehabilitation. And of course, it raises this complex question as to where individuals who might accept a plea deal would serve the remainder of their sentences, and what kinds of accommodations would either have to be made at the site itself, or whether third places could be found to serve out those sentences. Yeah.
I mean, is there KSM's already been in Guantanamo. He's been in American custody for 2 decades. He's been in Guantanamo since 2006. And the trial has barely started. Obviously, if he'd been if he'd gone to the Southern District of New York, he would be serving the rest of his life in an American prison. I mean, by his own account, he did this. I'm not prejudging his situation. He freely admitted that he was involved, and there's lots of evidence he was. So, I mean, in terms of this, it turns out that the Guantanamo military commission system has been I think Andy said, a total failure, because it's been tying itself in knots and knots and knots. And then, of course, it's complicated by the torture that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was subjected to. And so, I mean, Andy, in your view, is there any scenario in which KSM will ever have a trial, or it has to end in a plea deal, even though those plea deals seem to have not moved forward?
It's really hard to know by now, isn't it, Peter? I mean, I suspect strongly that there are parts of the government and the intelligence community in the United States who are happy for there never to be a trial. These men are held at Guantanamo. They're not going anywhere. That is a way of trying to make sure that the secrets of what they did to them are not exposed, I think. And I think that's one thread of the story. The plea deal negotiations seem to me to be the most practical way forward, unless there was to be an administration that would return to the notion of moving them to federal court and prosecuting them there. I don't see that happening at all. I'm not sure that it was a complicated issue, because the torture evidence will dog these men, whatever happens, or will dog the government rather. But my feeling about the federal court trials, when Obama proposed it and then withdrew under pressure from Republicans, was that I could have seen convictions, if anything resembling evidence was presented by patriotic juries in the United States. That may not have been a shining example of justice, but it would have led to some kind of resolution. And you know, the sad truth is that we just appear to be stuck forever with no just resolution to this problem, and a problem of the United States' own making.
And I would just add, you know, for the 9/11 families, the harms to them from a lack of justice are also enormous. Families whose lives have been suspended for over 2 years, and families who actually understand that showing up for one day a year where everybody says, oh, we remember, is actually meaningless when the key things that they need, which actually also include a commitment to lifelong medical and psychological treatment for the harms that they and their children continue to experience from the events of 9/11, that those families are also held hostage to this process. And I think one of the things that in my many, many conversations with 9/11 families, as Mahamadou knows, there are many families who have relationships with and who have reached out to former detainees, where there's a fundamental meeting of humanities in understanding what the costs to both were from the events on that day, as well as families who honestly, families who want the death penalty, families who want their day in court and are struggling with the lack of honesty from the government because of the failure of the government to engage with them transparently and say, the torture means that we can't give you what we promised you. So when you have a UN special rapporteur having to have those conversations with family members that governments won't have, you also know that this process is fundamentally letting the families down.
Vanilla, can I ask you a question? I mean, there was a time, you know, several years ago where there was an official, relatively high-ranking State Department official whose job it was to work out a way to return detainees to countries and kind of get these deals going. I have not heard of that official in the current administration. Is there such a official who's doing this job?
There is an official. Unfortunately, as we know, during the Obama administration, there was both the symbolic importance of the president deciding on the first day of his administration that he would close Guantánamo, an enormous amount by creating a cabinet level post and a post at ambassadorial level, a kind of a sense that the president's full weight lay in all of the conversations that were being had about transfers, a willingness to do what was required to make transfer happen. Now, I still would say in my report documents that there are fundamental flaws in what the Obama administration did, because it transferred individuals without actually committing to the care and responsibility of those individuals for the long term, and to simply, you know, disposed of them, to use a Kantian term, treating people like objects and as means, not as ends. And I think that is lived out in the daily lives. But we don't have the kind of political commitment that we need. And I think of some of the men who are left behind. I'm just going to mention one of them, an extraordinary artist called Moath Al-Alawi. I have a book about him that was just published a couple of months ago. This is a boat builder. He builds boats. He's an extraordinary artist, an artist that's recognized by multiple countries. And we had a decision from the US administration that the artwork can come out of Guantanamo. And that's a huge win in a way, because many of the men whose work, the brothers whose work was so important to them, couldn't get it out. And now we have the extraordinary position where the artwork can leave, but the artist cannot. And so, again, this requires, Peter, back to your question, this requires a high-level appointment. This requires the National Security Council and the president to get on the phone. This requires favors to be asked and favors to be returned. And it requires payment. It requires giving countries and individuals the resources they need to ensure that we close this prison. And it's regrettable that we are 22 years on and we do not see that level of commitment in the White House.
This is a question from another anonymous, but and sort of related, Vanula, which is there any sense in the Biden administration, well, you know, there's a 50-50 chance that it could be a Trump administration, and that if we don't, like, the clock is ticking, I'm sure they obviously want to win the election, but I don't see a Trump administration letting anybody out necessarily. I don't know, maybe when they were, Andy, would you know, did the Trump administration repatriate people or not?
One person.
The Trump administration released only one prisoner as a result of a plea deal that had been agreed. He himself was adamant about and fulfilled his desire to have nobody leave the prison. It's hugely important that the Biden administration recognizes the need for these men who have been approved for release to be freed. Fionnuala may know a bit more than I do about this. None of this is official, but but what I've heard is that there were plans for somewhere, and that they have been put on the back burner because of the situation in Gaza and presumably the attendant Islamophobia that accompanies it. But I think if we go back to that, there does appear to be a destination, and I mean it's not easy finding countries. I've been involved in trying to work here in the UK and in the EU. Countries are not receptive in the way they were under the Obama administration. Anti-immigration sentiment is so much higher across so much of the Western world now than it was 15 years ago. It's quite shameful when you see the comparisons, actually. But again, I have to mention the case of Majid Khan, who was the man who agreed in a plea deal, cooperated with the US authorities, was involved with Al Qaeda, and bitterly regretted doing that, and was fully apologetic and fully deserves his freedom and his new home in Belize. But for that came from high up in the government, that had to be negotiated, because that was the law. And that's the shame, that people who are less significant, people like Moath, who makes these ships out of recycled materials, and who, incidentally, was on the very first plane into Guantanamo 22 years ago today, cannot get out of Guantanamo because he and the others are too insignificant. That is so wrong.
This is a question from anonymous Mohamedou. What does torture what does torture rehabilitation look like?
I don't know where to start. For example, I don't want to be harassed. That's a good start. And when I was released, I was put under house arrest of sort. And I later on learned that that would be my destiny until I die. That came from an official that I know who happened to my friend and who had access to my file. So the US wanted me to die and never leave the country or share my story with the rest of the world. So that's the beginning, good beginning. When they released someone, they said, go in peace. You are not convicted of any crime. Beyond that, I want some kind of facilitating my reintroduction to society. For example, through resources or means that never happened. Not one single penny. I understand that the US government gives the government some money to surveil me, for example, and to report back to them what I'm doing, whom I'm calling, where I'm having dinner. That need to stop, because this is punishment outside the law. For instance, to this day, I didn't have any proper psychological or psychiatrical assistance. I'm doing this on my own. I came here and I bought my insurance, and I'm still on the waiting list. I want to be invited back to the US, and I want them to open investigation into torture. To this day, the only people held accountable in the US were the whistleblowers of a torture. Not one single agent was held accountable for torture that led to the killing and permanent injuries, like in my case, to the detainees.
I'm just seeing if there are any additional questions from the audience here. Well, maybe each of you could just, we've got a couple of minutes left. Fionnuala, have you got any final thoughts? And Andy and Mohamedou, maybe we'll go in that order.
I mean, I'd like to close just on to talk about the extraordinary resilience of the men who survived and came out of Guantanamo. They're artists, poets, writers, men who've rebuilt their families, who have gone back into their societies, who have survived. And I think it's enormously important at this point that we can continue to center in a victim-centered justice way the lives and the stories of those who survived. We have to stop dehumanizing men whose only crime in many cases was to be the victim of torture. And we have to elevate and affirm them as human beings. And I think that move, which is about really affirming the humanity of those who survive, is also a move towards acknowledgement, accountability, repair. And that's what I'd like to close with.
Andy?
Yeah, I think I would follow up what Fionnuala said. I think that, you know, the irony of today is that we're here with Mohamedou because this is online. But Mohamedou, like all former Guantanamo prisoners, cannot set foot on US soil under any circumstances. Mohamedou has been over to the UK many times. I'm hoping he'll come over again this year. We'll go around, we'll do events. So what's needed in the United States is publicity, is media and events. We can beam in former prisoners into venues. If you get venues, you can hear directly from people like Mohamedou and Mansour and other former prisoners. But the media should be involved as well. The mainstream media should be involved. The American people should be told the stories of the men that it has, in so many cases, so wrongly and brutally and unjustly imprisoned at Guantanamo, because that would be an incentive to finally getting the prison closed.
Thank you. Mohamedou?
I just want to second Fionnuala and Andy. I think we need to support people who do this kind of work like Fionnuala and Andy and many others, and to spread the word and to support them, because I have so many calls, so many calls, so many messages received after the release of the report that Fionnuala did, and it had really very big positive outreach, I would say. And we just need to support this kind of work and tell American people that we love them. As a former detainee, I don't hate American people. I love American people because now I know them. I did not know them before. And I know that American people are good people. And if they knew what I know, what Andy knows, what Fionnuala knows, they wouldn't allow Guantanamo to be open for one more day. Close the damn prison.
Well, thank you, Fionnuala, Andy, and Mohamedou. Thank you very much for participating. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. Thank you very much.